And welcome everyone. I'm Tanya, founder of StateUp, which is an insights and advisory firm focused on bridging the gap between the worlds of government and technology with the aim of improving citizens' lives. And it's a real pleasure to be launching our StateUp 21 work today with both a great range of speakers, but also a very knowledgeable, broader audience. So I hope we'll be able to draw on many of your thoughts and opinions over the course of the discussion. We're joined today for our panel by Tiffany Chu, co-founder of Remix, if you can give a wave, Aline Muylaert, co-founder of CitizenLab, both of which are inaugural members of StateUp 21, and Stephen Unger, a commissioner at the Geospatial Commission, and Daniel Korski, who is co-founder of Public. So before we move to our discussion with them on the future of GovTech, I'd like to take just a few minutes to give you a brief overview of some of the motivations behind StateUp 21 and what we hope it will offer to you. So just a little bit of context here. So StateUp 21 really emerges from the fact that I think by now it goes without saying that 2020 was transformative for governments everywhere, and well implemented digital technologies became mission critical, both for internal processes, but also to serve citizens well. And alongside many other kinds of organizations, GovTech startups, so that's to say startups working with public sector organizations in many parts of the world contributed to this transition. And I think their agility to respond to emerging needs was a real asset in this context. That said, GovTech remains a young sector in many parts of the world, if not every part of the world. And data in particular on the supply side, so on GovTech startups, is often scattered and it's not cohesively captured by general aggregators of information on technology companies. So what we wanted to do was bring our research and policy expertise to address this gap and to replace what can sometimes be hype narrative with both the data and the qualitative research to tell the story of the emerging sector. And we've done this with three primary audiences in mind. That's to say, policymakers and public servants, investors and entrepreneurs. There are others too, of course, that we hope this work will speak to. But what has really become clear to us is, there are many public servants who are interested in digital technologies and their public sector applications, but they need evidence to justify taking risks on promising young companies. Startups too have unmet information needs when it comes to the public sector, including, I think, that often they aspire to develop products and services that meet a public need, but they can struggle to spot opportunities in the government market, which is often unfamiliar to them. And finally, for investors too, this can often be unfamiliar territory and surrounded, I think it's fair to say, by lots of preconceptions. So by bringing together the macro sector analysis and then zooming in on a micro level to some detailed company profiles, we hope to meet some of these information needs. Now, because of the relative youth of the sector, meaningfully assessing the qualities that high-performing GovTech startups share, I think has been pretty difficult to date. But in assessing dozens, if not more, companies for potential inclusion in StateUp 21, some really clear patterns have begun to emerge. And we go into much more detail on these in StateUp 21. So if you haven't had a look at it, please do. But just to give you, a brief sense of what these qualities are, I think the first thing to say is they're not selling so-called innovations that public services don't really need, but instead the highest quality companies in this space are addressing and adapting to big public needs, which then of course creates resilience for their products and services. The second is that they show really good contextual awareness. That's to say they recognize local context, but also they often show real awareness of the policy context. So they recognize technology as supportive of policy levers, rather than attempting to replace them. So some of our inaugural cohort, companies like Privitar and Cyan Forensics, actually focus on implementing policy or regulation and assisting with that process. Third, and I think this is really important, they actively help public sectors create trust in institutions and in the technology that they engage. And this is more important than ever, where trust in institutions and actually in technologies itself is on really shaky ground. The ways in which companies do this take a number of different forms. But to give one example, logically, they fuse human and machine capabilities to help to address a very big trust issue, which is online misinformation. Fourth, these companies approach public procurement shrewdly, and that's something that perhaps we'll return to during the course of the conversation. And finally, investors are paying much more attention to these companies than perhaps we've seen previously. So it's been interesting to see that when speaking to lots of the companies, both that are in StateUp 21 and more broadly in the space, they all discuss the historical challenge of struggling to raise venture capital, and often public funds haven't been available either. But almost every startup that we spoke to also noted a shift in investors' perspectives since the start of the pandemic. And the data lives out this claim, and there are a variety of factors, I think, behind this. Here are just a few examples from the past year, but we do also document a more extensive range in StateUp 21. And I think it's important to add that the investments we are seeing are not random. They collectively point towards a very specific vision of how, in some quarters, a post-pandemic world is being imagined. So a few of those features that we're seeing: a green recovery, of course, a culture of some continued home working, including among public servants, a need to exchange data in a cyber-secure way, health and social care provision that's resilient to future pandemics, and a need for inclusivity. That's to say, quickly understanding, especially in this context of social distancing, what a cross-section of citizens are thinking and feeling in order to support decision-making. Also, just to mention that we do include a number of data visualizations on key subsectors and technologies. I'm not going to go into detail on them here, but we will be discussing some of those on social channels over the coming days, so do take a look there. But the focal point of StateUp 21 is, of course, the companies themselves. And our profiles cover 21 of the most promising startups working with public sectors globally. This isn't marketing material. They are independently and deeply researched profiles. Companies were chosen for a variety of criteria, including local and global impact, government partnerships, and innovative tech IP. And we focused very decisively on quality. So we took a stage and geography agnostic approach, and that's resulted in a final cohort drawn from the US and UK, Europe, Israel, and Latin America, and working collectively with governments in almost every region. We also have several ones to watch, which we think show lots of promise for the future. And I think it's really important to mention that these profiles were a product of the company's active participation, both in terms of sharing information and answering our questions. So I just want to take the opportunity to thank them for their efforts in that process. Meanwhile, I think it just remains for me to note that the foundation of our research is our database, Nebula, which is a selective quality control database of now actually almost 500 startups working with public sector organizations across verticals and across subsectors. And if that's something you'd like to learn more about, then please do get in touch with us. So this is a starting point for providing what we hope will be the highest quality sector-specific information and insights that we can. We really welcome feedback at this early stage. We want to hear about the kind of information and analysis that would be most useful to you. So please do get in touch with those suggestions and thoughts. And we also look forward to covering many more exceptional companies in this space. And what we'll do is put in the chat a link to the nomination form in case you're interested in featuring in the next edition. We do already have lots of nominations, so please do add yours to the mix. But for now, let's move over to our panel and bring them into the conversation as well. So I'd love to start by thinking about the fact that, yes, GovTech is a young sector, but I think, partly prompted by the pandemic, it's beginning to mature. And Tiffany, perhaps we can come to you first. For those companies like yours that were established a few years ago, are growing, in your case has an international footprint, what challenges do GovTech startups face now in terms of scaling up in the current context?
Hi, everyone. Thank you, Tanya. It's a pleasure to be here with you all this morning or this evening, wherever you are. I'll share a little bit about Remix to just kind of explain the context in which I'm coming from. So I'm an urban planner and designer by training, and Remix is a collaborative platform for transportation decision-making. We work with about 350 cities and agencies across 22 countries. So my perspective will be shaped not only by my experience in transportation mobility, but also having been, I would say, maybe one of the earlier ones in GovTech as we started the company back in 2014. So I would say the biggest challenge throughout COVID that we've experienced is everybody, including ourselves and governments, are being asked to do more with less. I remember the first couple of weeks right after lockdown in the US, we would call up our customers to see how they were doing, if they needed any support from us from a transportation mobility standpoint, because a lot of agencies were cutting service or rerouting routes to better service shelters and essential services, and et cetera. And many of our customers just did not even have computers or laptops from their city or their agency. They were working from home, but didn't have the tools that they needed because maybe their IT department wasn't prepared. Maybe there wasn't enough computers to go around. It was just, quite a bit of a night and day experience coming from somebody who works in tech and then seeing kind of where our customers are and needing to meet them where they are. So that was kind of our first big moment where we realized, okay, we really need to change up the way that we collaborate with our customers. And soon enough, they got their computers and mice and Zoom setups or WebEx or what have you. And at the same time, they were being asked to slash their budgets because they didn't know how much tax income was going to come to their department that year. And so being able to say, hey, all of these projects that you had on your agenda for this year, and not necessarily needing to say we need to slash half of them, but to say, hey, how can we help you do all of those projects, but maybe do it in a way that doesn't require as many resources, doesn't require as many extra, consulting services, and bring that more in-house to build up capacity for your staff and thinking outside of the box in that way, while simultaneously pushing for the envelope of accelerating local government's digital transformation processes, which had been ongoing for a while, but was obviously just put into overdrive over the last 12 months. So I would say those are my top of mind challenges that we experienced firsthand through our work with our customers. But obviously, I'm sure there are many, many more.
Thanks, Tiffany. And Aline, how does that correspond to your experiences from a European perspective?
Yeah, I think our experiences have been very similar. So I'm the co-founder of CitizenLab. We've developed an online engagement platform. We now work with more than 200 governments in around 15 countries, so mainly Europe and the Americas. And I think one of our main challenges has been keeping up with the speeds. So we work on digital engagement, and in normal times, governments, or mainly local governments, combine physical participation with online participation, and now all of a sudden they couldn't do that anymore. So we really saw a spike in demand in March, April, and also a really big difference between countries. So first of all, internally, it was, I mean, challenging, but also really nice to keep up with this, all the demands coming in. And we really also saw a different attitude of some countries compared to the others. For example, in the Netherlands, like their first response was like, okay, this is an opportunity for innovation, let's immediately do something. Whereas I'm based in Belgium, and theirs was like, yeah, let's take it slow. But they didn't. I mean, they didn't have time to take it slow. So it really forced them to speed up things. Whereas normally they're like, okay, we don't have time now, we can postpone it with a few months, but they couldn't. So it really pushed them to kind of take on a more startup mentality and really work on speed. And of course, there was a lot of pressure. We also really felt that we work a lot with like communications teams, and they had a lot of workloads. But in the end, I think we saw great results and more projects launched. But for them, I think it was really difficult to adapt to this really high speeds environment, because we were all in a crisis. We all had to adapt very, very quickly, and that needed quick implementations. So also on our end, we had to find people. So it was really intense, but I think we made a great impact.
Thanks, Aline, for sharing that perspective. And Daniel, you've of course thought a lot about issues like public procurement, but also investment into this space. Do you think that procurement, investor interest are sufficient currently to support sector growth?
It's a great question. And first off, thank you so much for producing this work. You know, wherever GovTech is on the Gartner hype cycle, and you know, however fast it sort of moved up because of the pandemic, it's so critical that we inject the kind of rigorous assessment that you're performing here with the report. So let me just kick off by thanking you for that. I mean, what does it take for a market to work? You need some people who want to build a product, some people who want to back them, and some people who want to buy it. And I think what we have basically concluded now is increasing numbers of people want to build it. You know, the likes of Tiffany and Aline were early starters, but increasingly we're seeing people coming out of you know, the health system, policing, the armed forces, wanting to build. Partly it's got to do with lots of larger societal forces. Increasingly, as you say, investors are interested in the market, obviously not at the rate that we see in comparable markets, fintech, certainly not ad tech, and so on. But we're seeing increasing interest, not just from specialized investors, but you know, broader investors who wouldn't think of themselves as GovTech investors. And then the question is, can you sell? And not just can you sell a little bit, but can you build on that little bit in order to sell more and more and more and scale into associated and adjacent markets and so on. And on that score, I still would argue we have a lot of way. The pandemic has helped because, to Aline's point, people are saying, well, hang on, is this an opportunity? Or if I have to do something differently, what can I do? What do I have to do? We see across different countries, particularly the UK, but also some parts of the US, the Netherlands was mentioned, Denmark, Norway recently, Lithuania, even Luxembourg. Real efforts to kind of create better procurement systems for smaller, more innovative companies that don't necessarily have the financial or even the delivery track record that larger players have. The big issue, though, is one we have to kind of address, which is working with more and more startups will require public officials to understand more and more of what they want and what technology offers. So yes, on the one hand, the answer lies in developing frameworks and marketplaces and using thresholds that allow smaller companies to pitch in at a certain volume of trade. But it also requires a real investment in the human capital side. And I hope we can get into that, because we need intelligent, not just intelligent sellers and intelligent investors, we also need intelligent buyers.
Definitely, and let's loop back to that point. Steve, just to come to you now, you work on the Geospatial Commission, which is focused on unlocking the value of geospatial data, whether on an economic or social or environmental level. So I'm really interested to hear some of the challenges and opportunities you see around innovation in that particular space.
So I think they're similar, in fact, to some of the comments that Daniel's just made. I think it's clear that there's enormous opportunity. And actually, that's very clear from your report. So I have to congratulate you on that report. Just reading the list of case studies that you've set out leaves me feeling enormously optimistic about what can be achieved. So, fantastic potential. There are clearly some important issues for the use of technology by the public sector, and they're not specific to the Geospatial Commission. I maybe come to a couple of examples of what we're doing. I mean, the generic points for me are, firstly, clearly there are issues about procurement, over complex procurement processes, not great for small companies. And through the many years I've worked in the public sector, I've often been frustrated in my desire to buy services from smaller companies. So that's always been a problem. And I think the other part of it is this point Daniel made about the intelligent customer. There's a tendency to have processes which are all about buying products and services, buying black boxes. And I think that's deeply dangerous in the tech sector. What's required is a partnership between the public sector and the private sector, in which the public sector learn about what technology can do through long-term partnerships with companies, and then buy products which, if you like, build capability as much as provide particular functions. So it's that thing for me about building capability in the public sector is really, really important. And certainly a large chunk of what the Geospatial Commission is looking at is, there are a set of issues around skills, understanding how people can work together to bring data sets together. So it's rarely just about, does the data exist? It's almost always about how can people work together to exploit it? Do they have the right skills? Can we find the right commercial models? Those sorts of questions. And I think we need to get better at that resolving those types of issues. What's interesting about the Geospatial Commission, though, is that some of these issues are quite generic. What I've enjoyed at the Commission is the ability to, by focusing on a specific set of challenges, finding solutions which can then perhaps be generalized. And perhaps just one example, there's a piece of work we did last year trying to build a national underground asset register to understand essentially all the stuff that's underground, so that when you dig up the road to lay something new, you don't dig up the old stuff. That requires a lot of cooperation between commercial companies, public sector as well. We were able to facilitate a type of dialogue in that specific case because people understood the specific value that came from that cooperation.
Thanks, Steve. That's really interesting. And, clearly there's a theme here around capability building. And also, I think, important to think about what capabilities are needed at different levels of government within different roles, and avoid taking a kind of one approach fits all. So I think an interesting thing to think about is, whose responsibility is that? Who should be responsible for upskilling policymakers in relation to technology? And particularly if we think about, where expertise lies, is that are the people who know lots about technology, whether that's in startups or large technology companies or universities, being properly engaged in terms of the process of upskilling? And I'd love to come to Aline, because I think you've actually spoken previously about the role that CitizenLab has sometimes played when working with public sector organizations in doing some of this upskilling. So it would be great to hear a little bit about your experience and your perspective on this one.
Yeah, I think some of the things we've seen, so we launched the company in 2015, is that governments increasingly believe that technology can bring them efficiency. That might sound very straightforward, but I think in the past, when governments had faced challenges, that they were thinking like, okay, we need more people, we need more FTEs, internally or externally, consultants were working for. And now we see, like, for example, with our platform, we can bring efficiency to how they run engagement processes, and they increasingly see that a system can do this for them, that they don't need the people, that they of course need both, but that I mean, a system can do that for them. And then what we also see indeed is that when governments work with startups or scale-ups, we can bring some of our workflows or processes to them. So for example, what many startups and scale-ups do is they growth hack their way through, and they do a lot of content marketing, they make a lot of buzz about what they do, and that can also really help move things forward. So for example, we work on citizen engagement, and we feel that where we're home based in Belgium, that the fact that we communicated so much about this, that we stress the importance of what we do, of our topics, since we're a social enterprise, that then also moves the topics forward. So using, the governments can also really benefit from, let's say, scale startup techniques, like growth hacking, content marketing, and you see that they start taking over some of these.
Thanks, Aline. And Tiffany, in your experience, have you seen a similar process? Have you been involved in some ways in upskilling the public servants that you're working with?
Oh, 100%. A lot of what we're seeing, especially in the transportation and planning and geospatial fields, is that I think formerly, if you didn't have, a degree in planning or a degree in GIS or a degree in, these kind of traditional fields, it was hard for you to advance, especially in local government, where they take credentials very seriously. You need a certain minimum level of skills to be able to be promoted, and et cetera. And I think with the advent of technology, it really is up to the staff member how excited and how proactive they are about learning these new technologies. And in many ways, they can do lots of things with one tool when previously they needed to link together 5 or 6 different, slightly more outdated tools from, even just a few years ago. And I think that digital literacy is, only getting started, especially in the government industry, as it starts to attract a new generation of public servants. And part of what we're trying to achieve at Remix is to democratize access to a lot of geospatial data. What Steve was saying was really resonating with me around creating a platform so that everyone can benefit from this data and not have it being locked up in different servers or databases for only the select few to access. So I think that data access in itself is a huge piece of the ability to increase the capacities, technical capacities of staff. And then in a lot of ways, there are places where, it may be worth bringing on a startup to help with areas that, you yourself may not need to build yourself, for example, what Daniel mentioned. And I think for us, with regards to big projects like transit system redesigns, or even small transportation improvement projects, we're doing a big project with Transport for London around this right now. And I think obviously their staff could do it if they had the time and the resources, but instead of hiring, 100 new planners, maybe invest in a little bit of technology, and then also upskill your existing staff as well.
Thanks, Tiffany. Daniel, what's your vision on this one?
Well, look, at the risk of sounding a slightly discordant note, I just want to say, look, it's absolutely the case that we learn by working with others, and it's undoubtedly the case that when smart, zippy, fast-moving startups work with, on the whole, slower-moving, more established traditional organizations, that there is an osmosis and a lot of knowledge is transferred. But come on, guys. I kind of want to say it's not the job of startups alone to transform public services for the modern age, and we have to demand much more of our governments. The diplomatic services of the world know that they need staff that can speak foreign languages when they send them overseas. And because they know that, they incentivize their staff to learn those languages. And not only do they do that, they offer them concrete training opportunities to learn Serbo-Croat, Cantonese, Afrikaans, it doesn't really matter. Why are we not seeing technology capability in the same way? Being quite clear about what kind of TQ, technical intelligence, that public servants need at various different levels, and then incentivize them in order to achieve those skills if they don't have them, and provide the ways in doing it. And working with startups is absolutely going to be the best complement to learning some of these things. And by osmosis, they will learn a lot. And I have no doubt that form of learning will be more impactful and certainly more enjoyable, as we know from our own lives. But that must not take away from, I think, a real demand that public officials and public administrations take the upskilling, the digital upskilling seriously. Because Tiffany, to your point, you said it's now up to officials if they want to avail themselves of these technologies. You're right, but it shouldn't be. It mustn't be. It's not up to a diplomat in China whether they fancy speaking Mandarin or Cantonese. It's critical to the pursuance of their job. And similarly, I think we need to kind of be quite clear and help governments get into a position. And maybe I'm being too hopeful and naive, but that's kind of where I come from.
No, thanks, Daniel. I think that's a really important point to make, that actually a multifaceted approach is needed, and also that's going to look different in different national and regional and local contexts. There isn't a cookie cutter model here. Steve, I'm interested in your perspective on this one, particularly as someone who's worked in both policy and regulatory roles, but also is currently affiliated to the Bennett Institute at Cambridge. So it also has that university dimension to it. Where do you think responsibility lies and capability lies for upskilling public servants for our digital age?
So I'm afraid it's shared, isn't it? So clearly, I would agree with that. The primary responsibility for upskilling civil servants has to be with the public sector. There is a caricature of the public sector, which is of civil service generalists, and a caricature in which specialists are almost sort of sidetracked. They exist, but they're not part of the mainstream. That clearly has to change. It's worth noting that an initiative was announced just a few weeks ago for a new approach to training and career development for public servants in the UK, which is all about making sure that across the civil service, not just within the specialist areas, there is an understanding of technology, that people have the analytic skills required to handle technology. I think that's a really important development and a very positive development. So, let's hope it works, but it's absolutely the right place to be. But then I do think industry also has a responsibility, and that goes to a comment I was making earlier, which is that it's important the industry doesn't just sell products to the civil service. It's got to explain to the public sector how those products work, so they can be treated not as black boxes, but as, if you like, examples of capability. So I do think there's an onus on companies. I know companies want to sell products and services. They want revenue streams, but they also need a long-term relationship, and that's based on a shared understanding of capability. And then finally, of course, universities have a role. Universities is partially about training, but there is also a public policy debate. So organisations like the Bennett Institute in Cambridge can drive the wider debate about how, as a society, we exploit technology. That's the other important part of it.
Thanks, Steve. And perhaps unsurprisingly, I agree with that point. And I also think it's really important when we think about sort of new generations coming through of public servants, that the intersection between technology and governance is sort of core to the curriculum that they're working through. So very much in agreement on that one. Just a reminder that we'll be coming to comments and questions soon. So do please either put comments in the chat or raise your hand, and we will try to bring you into the conversation. I want to ask about another topic that I think is on many people's minds at the moment, which is data and data sharing. So there's, of course, a lot of active conversation at the moment about whether and how important it is to share data, so whether that's from the public or private sector side, and its role in encouraging innovation, including for the public sector market. Tiffany, this is kind of at the core of your business. So what's your perspective on this one?
I think there is a fine line between publicly available data, which is what Remix primarily draws upon, and then also there's PII, personally identifiable information on behalf of citizens and residents. And that dividing line is very important to draw and to describe the nuances when you're speaking categorically about the concept of data sharing. I would say specifically within transportation, it gets a little bit complex because a lot of the data that we do use, not only census and demographic information to understand low-income and minority households and areas and neighborhoods better, but also looking at where people are going to and from, toing and froing everywhere. And that helps obviously decide and to plan more efficiently where services should be running to serve the most number of people, which is the job of public transport and mobility. Where the line gets a little bit blurry is when there are private mobility companies that are operating on the public right of way, and what is the responsibility of those companies in terms of data sharing with the governments that they may be contracting with, or maybe not even partnering with at all, and just using the right of way in the public space. So for us, we've found ourselves a little bit in between this debate at the moment, specifically when we work on behalf of the public sector and deliver, mapping and transportation planning platforms to agencies and cities. And at the same time, we often partner with public mobility companies who are maybe operating those services and may need to share some of that data to help their agencies and cities better understand how those services are being used. So where you are standing in the debate requires a different level of complexity of discussion. And I think it really depends on where that data is coming from and from whom, and do the citizen residents know that their data is being collected? I would say that's probably first and foremost number one. When it comes to a planning process, obviously you want as much data as possible, but you don't need all of the data all of the time. And as a planner, and the digital literacy and data literacy that comes with that profession now, you have to be very discerning around, you want the best data possible, but without necessarily compromising the privacy of your residents.
Thank you, Tiffany. And Steve, from the perspective of the Geospatial Commission, is this the kind of approach you're taking as well, or are you taking a different angle?
It's clear that most of the value that comes with data comes from sharing it, from combining different data sets. I think that's very clear. And I mean, the National Underground Asset Register I just talked about is one example. You learn a little bit if you know where one set of pipes is, but really you want to know where they all are. If you're working out where to dig up the road, basically you need to know where all the pipes are. And given that people are laying those pipes under the public highway, I think there's a reasonable right to know where they are. There are plenty of other examples. Where it gets complicated is that there are at least three sets of issues that you have to think about when you're thinking about data sharing. Firstly, there are definitely issues around data privacy that you have to think hard about how you deal with those. There are also issues about security, particularly when you're talking about infrastructures. You don't always want to tell everybody where all the pipes are. You want to make sure that information goes to people who have a right to know that information. And then sometimes the most complex point of all is that there are often commercial sensitivities. So if I could give another example, I'm currently chairing a task force which is looking at the use of location data for new mobility services. So, what could you do if you combined all the data that's being captured by different companies in terms of new mobility services, actually in terms of road safety? An interesting example was if you just knew which cars were braking and when, you could work out which junctions were unsafe before there was an accident rather than after. So there's enormous potential from that type of data. But on the other hand, companies are investing in that data. So it's quite important to develop models for data sharing, which also work commercially. You know, this is not about telling everyone to give away their data. It's about finding commercial models which allow sharing that works for the various partners. And I think that's quite an important part of what, you know, that's slightly more subtle than just saying that all data should be open.
Thanks, Steve. And I definitely agree with you on that one. And I also think it's an incredibly challenging area and model to be creating. Daniel, I know at Public you're doing some work in relation to data on online safety. So what's your perspective here?
Yeah, it's a really fantastic conversation, and really shows how mature the conversation is compared to just a few years ago when I was in government, and it was all, let's just push some open data, you know, out, and you know, the world will be a better place. I think there's a much greater understanding of the value of curating the data, of, as Steve says, ensuring that both different sources of public data and different sources of private data are brought together. The first thing I'd say is don't do something stupid. And the reason why I say that is because I was part of a government that sold the postcode, that sold the postcode data. And that has been a disastrous decision, I think, that we've had to try to work around subsequently. So, I mean, my first point is, I know, Tanya, that's not what you're going to focus on, but it's like, don't be stupid. Don't sell things and take them out of the public hands if that means you can't provide a greater, you know, public value. But I want to speak to the curation, and that's really what the online harms project that we're working on with faculty and DCMS is about. Is to take, how do we create a much more effective data interchange when the data is, in this case, data around online harms, sexual predation on the internet, terrorist content, what have you, you know, vaccine misinformation, whatever. How do you create a greater opportunities to analyze that data, use that data, if that data is, you know, on large platforms like Facebook and Twitter, on small platforms like independent niche games, you know, platforms, or you know, apps focused on helping new mothers, you know, cope with the first years, and so on and so forth. How do we overcome the collective action problem? And I think what's really interesting, and I think the Geospatial Commission is another great example of that, is that governments are increasingly realizing that they need to engage in an act of curation, bringing a number of different parties together, spending money themselves in order to facilitate us getting to a point where, obviously within the parameters that Tiffany rightly highlights, you know, privacy and so on, but we get to a point where that data can be exploited by a number of different actors. The interesting thing is we're now getting to that place, but it's still early days. You know, we're not, for example, there when it comes to energy data in the way you'd imagine that we would be. You know, Steve, you've mentioned some of the different geospatial data sets that aren't quite there yet. We're just beginning on the online harms side of things, and you could probably list another 10 data sets where we're not there. But increasingly government is sort of realizing they need to be the first mover and the first funder to overcome this collective action problem.
Thanks, Daniel. And I definitely agree there's some work to be done in terms of mapping the kinds of subsectors where actually, you know, the data sets either aren't there or aren't being shared in the right way. We're currently doing some work on infrastructure in the built environment with BEIS and the Centre for Digital Built Britain. And that's definitely something we're observing in that particular case. Can
I just make one small point, which is, and let's learn the lesson of those who've done it well, because many countries have done really successful projects. You know, Singapore and their geospatial portal is a real standout success. Denmark and their energy interchange, a really standout success. We don't always have to invent, you know, the wheel again. These examples are out there for us to copy.
Yeah, that's a very important point. I want to come to Antonio Moneo now, who has a question around financing.
Yeah, hello. Thank you for this event and for giving me the floor. I work at a very large bank in Spain, one of the largest actually, and I was actually contacting some of my colleagues in the investment department, asking them what was the opportunity that they saw in GovTech, and I was actually pitching them this opportunity. I was actually inviting them to this event. I'm actually also teaching a course in GovTech at a university here, and I'm explaining students what this is about. And sometimes I find trouble to, to picture what is the real opportunity for investment funds and for private investors. I sometimes see that, I worked at the Inter-American Development Bank, and I see this GovTech movement as an aspiration of the public sector innovators, so to speak. But I don't think, honestly speaking, at least here in Spain, that private investors have understood the opportunity. And sometimes I feel that they are reluctant to work with the administration because of the problems that we have highlighted here. So one of the most useful and inspiring things that I saw is in Crunchbase. There's an index of GovTech companies, which I think it's very useful. And it starts a way of speaking to investors, like highlighting what is the real opportunity, what is the growth of this industry, what is the size of this market, and what is the potential return on investment, how these startups are different or similar to others, how can they grow and scale up. So, it's a very vague question, but, probably the question is, what can you tell me so that I can convince my colleagues at the bank?
Great question. Well, why don't we go to the founders first, because I think they've probably done a lot of this work of persuasion. Aline, maybe we can go to you first.
Yeah, so we raised about 3 million over the past 5 years. We raised our latest round in 2019, right before the COVID year. And I think one of the things we're seeing alongside GovTech is that more and more, let's say, funds or companies are looking into social entrepreneurship and companies that have a social impact. And also when we were looking at investors, we not only wanted money, we wanted money from people who cared about what we were doing. And I think GovTech really has the opportunity there, because you're working with the public sector, and the public sector has a huge impact on the everyday life of citizens. So I think that can be also one of the arguments and one of the things that helped us pick one investor over the others, because we see a huge spike in the rise of social entrepreneurship from all kinds of perspectives, from the perspectives of people investing into it, but also from the perspective of people wanting to work only or more and more for people, for companies with a social impact. So I think from our perspective, that's really key, showing that we can provide them financial growth, but also a positive and huge impact on society at large.
Thanks, Aline. Do any of our other speakers want to jump in on this one?
I'm happy to share a perspective, which is good research shows that vertically focused companies tend to succeed more than cross-vertical companies. So, it is the case that you can be IBM, or you can be Accenture, or you can be a conglomerate, Ferrovial, or whatever, and it is the case that they succeed. But largely, vertically focused sectors tend to grow faster, tend to have higher profit margins, tend to succeed for longer. And I say that because one way to talk about GovTech is to say GovTech is taking advantage of that insight and applying it to one of the largest verticals in the world, the public sector. And I think in that way, people who aren't necessarily, driven by a sort of sense of public mission begin to think slightly differently. We've certainly found a lot of success. Of the 21 StateUp companies, I think we've got equity in about 4 of them, and those 4 have been enormously successful with valuations rising. We've also exited some of our businesses at considerable multiples. So it's the story is there for those who want to see it, but sometimes it needs to be explained slightly differently.
I think also because it's a young sector, the data is just emerging, as are the investors who are actually making multiple investments into the space. I think it used to be, even 2 years ago, it was very ad hoc. Maybe a VC would have 1 or 2 investments in the space. But one of the things we're tracking is actually investor patterns, and we're beginning to see that there are VCs who are quite specifically thinking about public sector opportunities. And in some cases, I can think of one example from Brazil, where actually it's really a pure B2G focus. So also happy to talk about that more offline, perhaps. Steve, I think, did you want to come in here?
Just briefly, and there's clearly enormous potential simply because the public sector is so big, and it's difficult to argue that it's as efficient as it might be. So there has to be potential. The question is, as always, is how you monetize it. And I'm with Daniel. The trick is to find something you're good at, specialize in a particular vertical, understand the technology that goes with that vertical, but also I think very importantly for startup, you need to understand how the public sector works. It's not enough just to understand the technology. You've got to understand how the policy world works, how policymakers work, so you can work with them. But that's another type of challenge. But there's enormous potential if you can find the right set of niches. There's no doubt about it.
Thanks, Steve. And I definitely agree with that point. As I mentioned in the presentation, that was one of the 5 qualities that was very notable among the 21 companies we selected, the ones to watch as well, but also a broader cohort of GovTech companies that we think are doing very well. They have deep contextual understanding. That means understanding policy context, cultural context, and not trying just to deliver cookie cutter approaches. I'd love to come to Tolu now, who has a very interesting and provocative question for our speakers.
Yeah, I was just going mostly off Tiffany's comment about governments coming to Remixed, asking them to do more with less. That kind of struck a chord with me because I was also working on an IDB project as a consultant on upskilling workers for the 21st century. A lot of the public servants that we spoke to also mentioned that their modernization programs were being conducted in the context of doing more with less. So, it's been a burning question of mine. How do we move away from innovation as a last resort to more proactive sourcing and implementation of innovation projects?
Thanks, Tolu. And it should be mentioned that Tolu, along with Riley, are 2 of the lead researchers on StateUp 21. So they've been looking at this sector in lots of depth. Tiffany, do you want to respond directly on that one?
That's a great question, Tolu. And if I had the answer, I would be maybe changing more of the world than I am right now. I would say that what I found as someone who worked in local government for a year under the umbrella of innovation as a Code for America Fellow at the City of Charlotte in North Carolina, I think innovation is often just it's like seen as like the other. It's not status quo. It's not what everyone else is doing. They're treated special. It's like a different department. There's maybe a chief innovation officer that gets to do like the fun stuff. And I think that's actually a disservice to that work. And also everyone else is doing very hard work, but maybe doesn't have innovation in their title. So I would maybe couch it as just not innovation as like doing a separate thing from what you're already doing, but just approaching old problems in new ways that anybody who's working in the public sector has the means to do, as opposed to a separate vertical that gets some special set of treatment. And I think only when you do that kind of empowering from an organizational level, everything from creating safety around making mistakes or running experiments that may not always be successful. Those are the hardest possible things to ask a staffer in the public sector to do, because any mistake leads to you being publicly shamed or you being fired or not being promoted. The negative impacts of making a mistake are just so large and the stakes are so high to running a pilot or an experiment that doesn't work. And I think that from an organizational standpoint is a much bigger change that is needed, as opposed to just innovation being no longer a bad word.
Thanks, Tiffany. Anyone else want to jump in there? Steve?
I don't quite recognize the problem, actually, in the sense that I've seen innovation used in a number of different ways in the public sector. So, I mean, for example, my own background before the Geospatial Commission was a CTO of Ofcom, communications regulator, where we saw a large part of our job as helping to drive innovation in new communications technologies because of the benefit for the wider economy. I mean, thinking right now, I can think of a variety of ways in which you could sell GovTech in, which is not just about efficiency of use of existing resources. So, for example, GovTech is also about promoting green growth, so meeting the environmental agenda. It's about improved safety, the online work that Tanya was talking about earlier. None of those agendas are about cost savings. They're all about delivering on policy objectives which go beyond operational efficiency. And I think that's how you expand the available funding. You deliver new things rather than just delivering existing things more efficiently.
Thanks, Steve. Does anyone else want to come in on this one?
Maybe just very quickly, I also shared it in the chat, but I think it's also really key for governments to attract young talent, to make the public sector sexy, let's say. I started as a student entrepreneur. I studied business, and I didn't have any course over the 5 years that focused on the public sector as a potential sector to start working in. So making sure that you have fellowship trainee programs in every department, really making yourself an inviting sector and organization to work for can attract people wanting to push for innovation and then make very innovative teams. So I think that's also really could be part of the solution.
Can I just add one thing? I put it on the chat, which is I think we have to be very careful to not to allow ourselves that GovTech is sold as a tool exclusively for efficiency gain. It can be, but innovation, efficiency is often the enemy of innovation. And you're, to Steve's point, trying to achieve a bunch of other things. And the second thing to say is, in many cases, the problem that the public sector faces is only partially solvable with new technology. It's often about different policy, different process. We've talked about people, and technology plays a role in that. But to then heap onto technology that it has to be solely responsible for the efficiency gain and it has to be the cutting edge, I think it's just, it's not acknowledging the importance of getting the right policy, getting the right, transforming the organization in order to deliver on it. And then technology comes and plays a role, some of which is going to give you an efficiency gain, some of which may be allowing you to do something totally different that you weren't able to do before, that forces you to recalculate entirely how you're spending money and what you're getting for the impact.
Yeah, I also think that if we think too much about efficiency as the product of GovTech, we risk also not thinking about other dimensions like accountability, for example, and the ways in which GovTech might help with some of those agendas. I recognize that our time is coming to a close. I have one final question that I would love to ask our panelists, which is really looking to the future. As we've been discussing, GovTech is a young but maturing ecosystem still. So I'd be really excited to hear where you see gaps and opportunities over the next, let's say, 2-3 years, either in relation to specific public sector needs or at actually an ecosystem-wide level. What's missing? What's still to be done? And I recognize that could lead us to chat away for another 2 hours. So if you can keep it limited, that would be even better. Should we go to Steve first?
Gosh, I was trying to think. One answer is difficult. I'm very keen on this point about building capability. And just one example of that is everyone's fascinated by artificial intelligence, machine learning. An awful lot of people don't understand it and either think it's magic or frankly don't understand what it can do for them. So I think there's enormous potential clearly over the next 2 or 3 years in building an understanding of what it can really do, both within government and within the private sector, and then starting to deliver on that promise, but also understanding what it can't do. There's a load of stuff. I mean, online harms, the stuff that Daniel was, I've done a lot of work on online harms myself. That's one of those areas where you need to have a really clear understanding of what will still require human judgment versus what you can automate. That's really important.
Thanks, Stephen. Definitely agree with that point. And, as mentioned before, logically, one of the companies that we focus on, I think one of the reasons they were selected is because they recognize that need for both human and machine to be working together. Aline, would you like to take this one next?
Yeah, I think one of the opportunities we see today is greater collaboration and partnerships between startups working for the governments, because what we often see is that we do a pilot with one department and then another department is doing a pilot with another company, and then you get a lot of different pilots, a lot of different tools, but eventually what we do is we are B2G, B2 government, but in the end to citizens. So we really need to prioritize the user experience of the end user, the citizen, and make sure that different companies, startups, governments are working with are really, incentivized to work together. And what we see, like behind the scenes, we're trying to convince companies to work together because there's no real incentives from the governments themselves. So I think that's a real opportunity for us and the ecosystem in the coming years.
Thanks, Aline. And I think that also really goes back actually to the question about capabilities, because in some ways that actually requires a different kind of project management tool set for the policymakers with whom you're potentially working. Tiffany, over to you.
I would say my hope for the biggest trend in the next couple of years is to see governments play a bigger role in helping their communities respond to climate change. And I think one of the big pieces that I've seen in my role with the City of San Francisco on the Environment Commission is there are lots of ways that policy can be designed as a carrot and not as a stick when it comes to helping residents and citizens move in the right direction with the energy transition, and to provide those in the most user-friendly way so that government services and combating climate change can move towards the same goal, because right now sometimes they move in different directions.
Thanks, Tiffany. And I think actually, that's one of the things that came out in the report, that green recovery is an area that investors also are very interested in. And in terms of focus points for where we're seeing money go into GovTech startups, that's absolutely one of them. Daniel, what's your perspective?
Well, I guess, we're in the middle of a global pandemic, and it feels natural to reflect a bit on what we've experienced and how that'll help us answer the question. And obviously lots of people will draw lots of things out. I want to draw just two simple things out. One is there is increasing interest and need for individual citizens to manage their health, their affairs, being able to access their patient records, integrate them effectively with non-clinical data sets, being able to share that when they want to in a sort of Dropbox style manner, with employers, with restaurants that they have to get into, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. We have seen only the very beginnings of that now. And I think it's probably reasonable to assume that over the next couple of years, we will see a flourishing of tools to allow citizens to take personal direct control in various different ways of key health-related data sets and experiences. The flip side of that is we've also seen in the course of the crisis that your health impacts my health. It matters what Aline in Brussels, Steve in London, Tiffany in America, and you, Tanya, and Cambridge are doing, and what you eat and who you speak to, it impacts me directly. And so there's a much greater need for dynamic societal level, data exchange, and that will require a very different infrastructure than the sort of legacy, on-premise legacy systems and with unstructured data sets that can't move from one I was about to say one column to another. And it'll require a different mindset, to Tiffany's point about privacy, and it'll require greater interest by public officials. But I think the future is going to be, more stuff in your hand and greater ability by the public realm to integrate these data sets in order to understand, diagnose, and hopefully promote the public good.
Thanks, Daniel, for ending on a note of really quite large scale, potentially reset for us to be thinking about. I think that's a good note for us to be ending things on. I can see that there are some more questions in the chat, but our time is drawn to a close. So if anyone has answers, please do feel free to answer directly in the chat. It remains for me to say that, as mentioned, we are at the beginning of our work on analysing and bringing high quality information around the GovTech sector to the policy audience, to founders and entrepreneurs, and to investors. So if this speaks to any of your needs, then please do get in touch with us. We'd be really happy to continue the conversation. Thank you, though, for now to our speakers for a really great and insightful conversation. And thanks also to all of our participants for joining today. Looking forward to more soon. Bye, everyone.
Bye.